Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine presented by the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. So as you start to gather with family and friends around the holiday season, when they start speaking crazy talk to you, you can first tolerantly and then gently let them down from whatever ledge they've found themselves on. You can find podcasts of our broadcasts on our YouTube channel. Search Freedom and Prosperity Radio, and you can read more about our work at the Virginia Institute at our website, tertiumquids.org. Our first guest this week has written a brilliant piece for the Pacific Research Institute. It is titled My Life in Poverty and Why Socialism Doesn't Work. And as we welcome Damon Dunn, fellow in business, and writes a column for the Pacific Research Institute, regularly called Free Markets 101, to the program. First and foremost, Damon, welcome to the program, and thank you for sharing some time with us.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to join you today.
Well, thank you for that. I must say that I find that given that they are the group of political office seekers that often espouse the most conservative-sounding belief structures, I find it fascinating that I think I'd find a Republican more likely to discuss race than poverty. And I don't understand why. It's like outside of the White House, the normal run-of-the-mill Republican doesn't want to talk about poverty as if somehow it's not an issue they can win, and they're ceding the economic ground to the socialists of Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. So bless you for writing this, because it at least gives me some ammunition to say, listen, look at how easy it is to talk about, the uplifting sides of capitalism. What was it that made you, after all this time, say, I've really got to write this white paper on this?
Well, obviously I grew up. My mom had me at 16. My father was killed when I was 3, and I lived with my grandparents in a trailer, literally for 11 years, and there were 10 people in a 3-bedroom trailer. We didn't have hot water, had to boil it on the stove, pour it into the bathtub with cold water, and we took turns taking baths, and we were on government cheese and food stamps and free reduced lunch and Medicaid. We had all of those welfare programs. And I have seen people like AOC and Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and pretty much all of the presidential candidates have some form of this democratic socialism. And that's different from where the government owns the means of production. So I wanted to drill in on them specifically when they compare us to the Nordic states or the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Norway. And I really wanted to educate the public on the unintended consequences of increasing the welfare state. They talk about it, Bernie Sanders and the far left, the socialists, they talk about it in terms of giving people things and then accessing votes as a result of their empathy, right? I'm going to give you these things and you're going to have economic empowerment. You're going to have socio-economic mobility. But the reality of it is that's not true. I actually grew up living on welfare. I grew up incredibly poor. I ate mayonnaise sandwiches 3-4 days a week for dinner. And you know what I learned? I learned that the large welfare state is the new slavery. And I mean that literally. They've taken the shackles off of wrists and off of ankles, and they're enslaving us with public policy. And let me tell you why. Because my grandparents, I used to watch them every single month making sure that they were not above the income threshold so that we would not lose all the benefits that we had. Because $1 above the threshold to qualify would eliminate all these benefits, and we would have needed to make tens of thousands of more dollars to replace all the free and reduced lunch and the government cheese and the food stamp programs and the Medicaid programs and the housing subsidies, all the things that we had access to. And so it was working against them to keep them poor, to not stretch or strain for making any more money. And so over time, they've now passed those same policies down to my uncles, and my grandparents died poor. They were told, we're going to give you these things and it's going to be socioeconomic mobility. But over the course of their lifetime, they stayed poor. They had incentive to stay poor. And then they died poor, waiting on what the left is telling them was going to be their opportunity to move up. And then really the second thing there that really concerns me is, my mom was a single mom. It works to keep families apart, right? I mean, what happens is that if you add a new man to the household and your household income then goes above the threshold, then you're no longer eligible for these benefits that we have access to. So it even keeps families apart. These are the unintended consequences that nobody talks about. No one looks back at the efficacy of all these welfare programs to determine the war on poverty. Did anybody actually move out of poverty through these programs? And the answer was no. And I have a story that allowed me to move out of poverty, but it was based on getting a skill set. You get an education or you get a vocation, and you have an opportunity then to have a life and earn wages where you don't have to work in low-income communities.
Damon Dunn, fellow with the Pacific Research Institute, writes their Economics 101, their Free Markets 101 column, and find out more about them at pacificresearch.org. So much in your story is right out of central casting, Damon, and we've run into it here. We have subsidized housing, 25% of the population in our flagship city, despite trumpeting 2.7% unemployment, can't make enough money in the city to live anywhere near the city because they restrict the access to property, they restrict the access, and then laughably when their architectural and planning boards are presented with somebody who wants to build SRO, low income housing, they tell him, no, that's not within the master plan that we wrote 25 years ago and is now somewhere just a slightly above Marx and Engels in terms of hierarchy and books that they don't violate, and it's heartbreaking because exactly what you said. I've had families come up to me and say, we're getting kicked out of our subsidized housing because our teenage son got a job at McDonald's on the weekend because he wanted extra money, and now we're out. And it's you're just telling people cheat or give up, and how horrible a mindset is that. I'm embarrassed to think of what our founding fathers would think about that kind of scenario.
Yeah, and conservatives, what we have to do, free market. People that support free markets, we have to do a better job of explaining to people that, okay, look, we have our most vulnerable, and we're not advocating that we're not going to take care of our most vulnerable. But the problem we have is that when they start passing it down generation to generation, and what conservatives have to do, we need to come back and say, listen, the safety net will never be a trampoline. If you don't have the right components to it. Most of what the left is pushing, they're pushing the safety net as a mattress. You just lay on it and you're fine. The upward mobility comes from gaining skill sets. It comes from being able to finish school or getting an associate's degree or getting a vocation degree. And that's one of the policies that I support, which is moving to a K-14 school model, which allows students to finish in the same timeline if we go to year-round school. But you can finish at the local community college, and you're going to finish with an associate's degree. You have 2 years of school paid for, reduces what your debt will be when you go to a 4-year school, or you finish with one of the 30-plus vocations, whether you're a radiology technician or a certified nursing aide or any number of the vocations that are there at these at our local community colleges. And now we're dumping, because we're averaging about 3.6 million seniors that we graduate in the United States each year, and we're dumping minimum wage workers into our labor force. And a person that graduates high school is no more qualified than the person that dropped out of high school. And so we're celebrating something that's not really worthy. I remember in the early 1900s, there was a huge high school push. People only finished school through 8th grade. And then as we went into the industrialization period of our history, there was a huge movement in the early 1900s for it to have a full high school movement. And now we need to have a movement where the minimum requirement is that you're finishing with an AA or you're finishing with a vocation. And now we're dumping 3.6 million skilled workers into our labor force because it's about labor skill. It's not just about unemployment. We could be at 2.7% unemployment, but if a significant portion of our population, 35-40%, are working at levels that are minimum wage, then we have an issue here. It's about improving the bottom. It's about giving more opportunities and earning more wages for our less skilled workers. And the only way that comes is through gaining skill sets.
Damon Dunn is on with us, Senior Fellow Business and Economics, Pacific Research Institute. Damon, you made a point just then that really strikes home with me, because I tell people all the time, your wage is driven by the uniqueness of what you do. And as a society, we seem to pat ourselves on the back when we create jobs by empowering mixed-use development. I watch it all around Virginia. Oh, we've got a mixed-use development. That's a shopping center with apartments or condos in it. So you've got basically $200,000 condos over, retail stores paying minimum wage. So nobody who works, maybe a manager who runs one of these grocery stores or restaurants, can afford to buy or maybe rent one of the condos. But basically, it's a shopping center with a built-in customer base. But we're growing the economy on retail, easily transferable jobs where the skill set isn't specific, the skill set isn't defined, and it's very hard to rise above it because the employee is so easily replaceable with somebody else. We need to take another side of this and look towards the marketplace and creating more high-paying jobs. And it's not as if the government can create it, Damon, but talk about this side of it. What do we need to do from a policy level to whether decalcify some of the free market? Because I worry that the capitalism our kids are growing up in is really crony capitalism with 4 or 5 really, really big companies and very few other ones that compete in these marketplaces for technology jobs, code writing jobs, and those kind of things that feed into it. What do we need to do on that side of the economy?
That's a great question, and I'll try to address parts of it. You look at, what our GDP is, C plus I plus G plus X, so consumption plus government spending plus investment plus net exports, and we're about 70-75% consumption. That's a bad thing for the United States. That means we are the world's buyer. Mm-hmm. People ship things to us and we buy. And I think where we really do need to look at our trade agreements. As a free marketer, I do believe in free trade, but the questions we have to ask ourselves, is trade good if we lose jobs and we become a buyer, right? So we reduce the price of what a television will cost that we're getting from China, but then we lost the ability to manufacture a television here and the jobs that go with those televisions. I think we have to reevaluate what trade means. I think a win-win trade is where we're able to increase net exports and also reduce pricing. And if we can't have trade deals that allow us to be able to increase net exports, which means that we're manufacturing these things here in the United States, we're shipping those things out to other countries, then we're not going to be able to continue to build that large job base. And that's what we've seen erode over the last 3-4 decades, is that it's cheaper, labor's cheaper, materials are cheaper, they don't have all the regulatory policy in a lot of these other places, and even adding the shipping cost onto it, it's still cheaper to produce these goods in other countries. And I get it, China plays manipulation games to keep their prices low and so that they will be the manufacturer, but it's trade everywhere, whether it's the NAFTA agreement or the new agreements that Trump was able to negotiate. Another side of this is investment. We have to have, obviously, what we support as free marketers, supply-side policies that keep tax rates low, that keep macro monetary policy that keeps rates low, which they are now, which gives business and individual sole proprietors access to capital at lower rates. So we're doing that really well. So where are we missing? In every economic philosophy, every economic theory, whether you're a supply side person or whether you're Keynesian, they both have the same underlying requirement. If you're a Keynesian and you are believing that there are millions of people on the sideline that are unemployed and that you can just have shovel-ready projects, you're assuming that those people are skilled labor. And if you're a supply-side guy, you must believe that if we have low rates, favorable monetary policy, low tax rates for businesses and for marginal tax rates for people that own LLCs and LLPs and S corporations, then you must believe that we have entrepreneurs and business owners. These are skilled people that are ready to move once you have those policies in place. The problem is that we don't have enough skilled workers. If you look at our worker pool, it's not because we need necessarily more higher paying jobs. We need more people that have higher skills so that then they can go out and create those jobs, and they also can move to jobs. I think there's 6 million jobs that are still available right now in the U.S. that are in the lower middle income to middle income, but we don't have people to take those jobs on. Remember when we had the GI Bill after World War II, where veterans came back and they would have access to different education and programs? If we were able to reduce federal foreign aid, we spend about $49 billion a year in foreign aid, I would come in and say, let's reduce foreign aid by 50%. We can't invest in other countries more than what we're going to invest in here. And I get it, there's soft power, but we needed soft power when we didn't have NATO and United Nations, and we didn't have monetary fund, and we didn't have 800 military bases around the world. We have enough soft power through other things. We need to bring $25 billion of that back. And what we would do with that money, my suggestion would be for us to have a GI type bill for adult workers that are displaced, that need new training to be able to take on new jobs that make higher wages.
Okay, we'll vote for you. No, I'm sorry. Damon Dunn is a fellow business economics at the Pacific Research Institute. You mentioned something earlier. You're talking about a K-14 model where people can come out with certifications. Do you also include in this, and we didn't get into specifics, but this has bothered me for some time. I raised 3 kids of my own, and most of my time was spent on helping them figure out what they really love to do and what they were really good at, and then directing them towards that end. And to me, that's where we're failing kids in K to 12. Yes, we see test scores going down. Yes, standards of learning and the No Child Left Behind. But when you say No Child Left Behind, part of that is, I want a kid, by the time he gets to junior high school, and certainly by the time they're in high school, to have some inkling of what they really love to do, what really lights their fire, so they'll jump out of bed at 5 o'clock in the morning and do it because they really feel fulfilled for doing it. And are we doing a decent job? I feel like we're not exposing our kids to all the different things that they could do so that they can find out what it is they do, as it certainly seems like you did, despite all of the issues you were facing growing up.
That's a really good point, and part of it has a public policy answer to it, and part of it just is a social component. I'll address the social component. It's just simple as growing up where I grew up. I didn't hear about I grew up, on a farm in a trailer. I didn't hear about being a real estate developer. I didn't know what private equity was. I didn't know how to get a job in financing. I didn't have anyone who had an MBA or someone that went to law school and had a JD. So I was underexposed. I know that's the extreme example of people that are in poverty, but it's addressing the social issue that you're talking about, which is, allowing our children to be exposed to different opportunities. And it makes a difference. Think about Germany. I actually played in NFL Europe one year, and I lived in Berlin. And when I was in Germany, I realized that when you get to ninth grade, you choose one of 2 tracks. You choose a vocation track or you choose a university track. So they're already starting to separate their children, to separate the education into vocation and through university immediately in the ninth grade, and now they start exposing people to different types of careers and different types of trades and different types of opportunities. We don't have any of that. Right, we got rid of SHOP. We got rid of all the vocational programs in our high schools. We're doing the bare minimum, what requirements are for all the different subjects to be able to graduate without any exposure. So there's a social piece to this, and then there's an education, public policy piece to this, to where we can do things what you see, that are very similar in Germany. And then ultimately, they have to be able to access skill sets through whatever the government-funded education is. And right now, we're just wasting money on our K-12 education because it's not effective. What people are graduating with, if you're no more qualified than someone who dropped out of high school, you both can go get a $7.50 minimum wage job. You have a high school diploma and you don't have a diploma. That means it's a waste of money. We have to rethink how we're educating, and we need to take the next step. We got to move into the next century. I mean, that's just where we're headed. Automation, artificial intelligence, we have to embrace this. We got to have dreams to go to the moon like they had in the 1960s. We don't have that right now. We need politicians and people that are involved in public policy to have vision, to see beyond where we are, to see further ahead, to see clearer, to see before others, and to start moving us that way. But there is no new frontier for us right now. Everyone's just spitting out old supply side policies and old Keynesian policies, and because they've been in politics for some long period of time, they have credibility, and we should just elect them. We need someone who has inspiring ideas, and I don't really see anybody out there that's running on the left that has any ideas to inspire us and to improve our skill sets, which would allow us to improve our wages.
Well, sadly, I don't hear a lot of them on the right either, Damon, and that's why I find you so refreshing, because you're not like a lot of think tank friends of mine who are just like, well, back in 1910 when we,
Right.
Let me ask you about this, because it's bugged me a little bit from a social structure. I feel like we're in kind of the same place we were in the beginning of the 20th century. As the Industrial Revolution got going, the nature of work was changing, what we did for a living. And as we get into now the 40th year of the technological revolution, I think the same thing is happening. The logo of our flagship station was made in a website that I went to, and I just posted the job, and a bunch of people bid on it and said, here's what I think you could get, and I picked one and I paid them. It's part of the gig economy. These things, the economy has become so much more. you could call it entrepreneurial, you can call it much more freelance, or you can just use the phrase that pays in Washington, the gig economy. But there's so much more than just Uber and Lyft in the gig economy. These freelancers, do we need to still kind of come up with ways that public policy better addresses this freelance economy?
Man, I'm so excited to answer this question. No one's ever asked me directly this exact question, and I'm standing on the tiptoes of expectations to answer it. So we always talk about China, or you hear people come up with the, with the thesis that China one day is going to surpass America. Think about this: they have 1.3 billion people in China. We have 330 million. I think we have a $19 trillion economy. They are at about $14 trillion. So you're talking about 5 times fewer people, 330 million, producing a lot more GDP than 1.3 billion people. Mm-hmm. How does that happen? It happens, and I'm getting to the answer to your question right here. It happens because the United States has these unique ecosystems. We see some in Israel. We see some now in China and Beijing. We see some at the Indian Institute of Technology. But we have these unique ecosystems, and we need public policies to support and to add into these and invest into these ecosystems, meaning we can go from carrying 5 books in our hands to the idea of a backpack and carrying 10 books on our back, to the idea of an iPad or Kindle with 1,000 books in a piece of technology. We go through that iteration more efficiently than any other group of people in the world. We're more productive. Why? Because you look at Silicon Valley. In Silicon Valley, you have angel capital. That's before you're profitable. It's just before you have your beta built. Someone's going to invest because your idea is right. You have private equity once you're up and you're profitable and you can get growth capital to grow your business. They have all the research universities, Stanford and Cal Berkeley, and so they're turning out people that are doing research. They have the subsidiary technology companies from Facebook to HP to Google to to Yahoo, all these companies that are in conglomerate in that area, and they have access to workers as they innovate new products and new ideas and incubate new ideas. You have all of the people that are concentrating in those areas, all the way out from not only to the conventional capital, to regular banks, and then they also have the distribution channels, and all the way out to the retailers. We can do everything, and we have these ecosystems. We see it in Research Triangle. We see it in our banking systems in Chicago and Boston and New York. Mm-hmm. You see the biotech down in San Diego. And so we have these unique ecosystems that we can drop ideas in, and it can go from idea all the way through to outlet and all the things that are needed to get it from idea to distribution and retail selling. Every country doesn't have a lot of those ecosystems. And so from a public policy perspective, you talk about freelancing and more entrepreneurship and people that are looking at, being innovators. You need to invest in the infrastructure that we have here in the U.S. that allows us to be more dominant and be the most productive people in the world. 330 million people creating the most GDP in world history. We're the most productive people in the world. Why? Because we have a great college education system. We have dynamic ecosystems, and we have to invest in those ecosystems and in our secondary education.
Mm-hmm. Well, and one of the things that you mentioned earlier, nothing to me is more dispiriting than watching a kid grow up thinking that they have nothing to contribute, because right. There is that itch inside that says, I absolutely do. Damon, it has been absolutely a joy to meet you. I wish I could think as fast as somebody who's a Stanford grad, but I've tried to hang on for dear life here. That was just brilliant. And if you've enjoyed listening to it on the radio, go back later this week. It'll be up on the YouTube channel. Share this part with every one of the people you know. Damon, I hope to have you back on again soon. I may just give you the show. I don't know, but your column.
I enjoy it, man. I love discussing good ideas. I read a lot. I'm intellectually curious, and hopefully one day I can be in a position to put some of these policy into place.
Well, it's Free Markets 101, pacificresearch.org. Damon, you have a wonderful Thanksgiving if we don't talk to you before then, and thank you for joining us this week.
Hey, thank you, and God bless.
Coming up next on Freedom and Prosperity Radio, Nancy Smith, political director from Middle Resolution PAC, on Virginia's postmortem of the 2019 elections. On Freedom and Prosperity Radio next.